So as I mentioned in my other video, which I'll put a link to up above, it's sometimes difficult to understand what is optimal crank length, or what should we be looking for, what does the research say about it. So we're going to go over some of that right now. But it first helps to kind of just briefly go over, again, what are some of the benefits that we see with going with a shorter crank. The two most obvious ones that people gravitate towards are, first of all, when you go with a shorter crank, this means that at the top of the pedal stroke, you'll be in less hip and knee flexion, and this creates less stress at the knee and at the hip. And so if you're someone that potentially has problems in these areas, it can certainly mitigate some of the issues that you might have, for instance, like anterior knee pain and among other things. The second main benefit is really popular with triathletes because the shorter cranks can allow you to be in a slightly more aggressive position on your bike. Now, we can do this because we're, again, coming up into less hip flexion, and so we're closing off that hip angle with our torso when we're in the aggressive aero position. And so if with a shorter crank, that thigh doesn't come up as high, and so we can actually lower the front end of the bike for some people. So you really can't get into the ins and outs of crank length without really going into the research of Jim Martin, who's I believe is still at the University of Utah, and John McDaniel. Especially Jim Martin's done a lot of work on this. And if you haven't, if you're interested in this, you can really just look up and read everything that these guys have research papers on, and you'll definitely get a better understanding of the debate here, or the issues involved. I'll put a link to the research articles that I found that I used for this video that you can go and take a look at them yourself. So let's hit the main points of what research tells us about crank length. So the first point is that there seems to be little downside to opting for a shorter crank when you're kind of trying to make a decision between two of them. Much in the same way that I've found that for cleat position, erring on the side of having the cleats a little further back generally has less downside than having them too far forward. And I think much in the same way, erring on the side of having a shorter versus a longer crank, you're going to end up with fewer potential problems anyway. And again, this goes back to the fact that a longer crank introduces more hip and knee flexion and can introduce extra stress on these joints. The second point is that through the research, they've kind of determined that you can still generate power with shorter cranks. That's always been a concern, and that's one I hear a lot from people, is that they're worried if they go to shorter cranks, they're going to lose some power. While some of the research, it does show there are decreases in maximal power, when we kind of normalize the data for the gear that you're in, meaning like just being able to shift gears and run a bigger gear when you do have a shorter crank actually makes up for this. So in general, shorter crank doesn't mean less power. The third point is that while it seems like leg length should be a good predictor for crank length, it doesn't appear to be so. And so what this means is that two individuals with the same inseam, let's say, could actually be slightly more efficient on different length cranks. So out there and available, there are some charts and some formulas where you can kind of try and predict your crank length based on your leg length, your inseam, or your height. And while these might not be a bad place to start, they're definitely not going to tell you the whole story, and they might not get you to exactly the length that you need. Keep in mind that these equations and charts were in some part determined by some of the potentially false pre-existing notions we had about leg length determining crank length. So take them for a grain of salt as far as that goes. The fourth point is that many of the differences that we see between one crank and the one that's either a little longer or a little shorter than it are very fine differences. It's very, very fine details to the point where sometimes we could be splitting hairs. So especially when we're talking about aerobic efficiency, it brings to mind something I found is a quote from Jim Martin, the researcher, where he said, we determined modest changes in oxygen consumption across a large variation in crank length, anywhere from 145 millimeter cranks all the way up to 190 millimeter cranks. So, in effect, switching from 175 millimeters to 172.5 millimeters would likely have little measurable or even detectable benefit. If you're going for a measurable aerobic benefit, for instance, aerobic efficiency benefit, you might certainly have to go for more than a 2.5 millimeter adjustment. It's actually almost guaranteed. And that's why we are starting to see cranks that go significantly shorter into the low 160s, 150s, and even into the 140s at times. Now, one of the most interesting things to note is that they found out that oxygen consumption actually, it increased, not with cadence, it actually increased with pedal speed. And that may not seem like a distinction, but it is. What that means is if we look at two different length cranks, we have a 160 millimeter crank and we have a 175 millimeter crank. And they're both being turned at the same cadence. Let's say they're both being turned at 90 RPM. That longer crank has a faster pedal speed. And so that's why that longer crank does require more oxygen to turn it at that speed. And this is part of the benefit for the shorter cranks.
So imagine that the green dot represents the longer crank arm since it's further away from the axle of the wheel. And as this wheel turns, both dots are turning at the same cadence, the same number of revolutions per minute. However, the green one has to cover much more distance, and so its linear velocity is higher than the pink dot.
And I think this was definitely one of the keys that they found in their research that kind of led them down this path to seeing a better efficiency with shorter cranks, because when they were turned at the same cadence, there was less pedal speed and therefore less oxygen consumption. One thing I think would be interesting for future research and for us to understand better, because when people often change to a much shorter crank, like they lose 15 millimeters to 2 full centimeters, let's say, that's a big change, and it feels funny sometimes. It feels different, and a lot of these research studies are obviously not long term. These are measuring short term benefits and short term problems, and it'd be interesting to see what happens to people's efficiency when they train on these for a long time on the shorter cranks. In my guess, and also from my experience, is that for most people they would find that the efficiency gains, obviously they stick around, but it feels less funny, and we get even more efficient on them as we kind of adapt our pedal stroke to them. So I think that would be interesting to see even further into the future is, how do these things look, a year down the road once the person's ridden them for a while. And my guess is that it only gets better, really. So that's it for this one. I know I probably introduced more questions than answers, but there's a lot here. There's a lot to unpack, and so I just tried to present it in a simple way as possible. If you have any further questions, please put them in the comments below. I will definitely try and get to all of those. Let me know your experiences with crank length. If you know of anybody that might be interested in this video, please share it. That always helps. Check out other videos that I've got up, please. And if you haven't, subscribe. Thanks, guys.